every aspect of human justice, human rights in our country for people to understand that there is a whole spectrum of trauma that has happened to communities, has happened to individuals, has happened to, in ways that have impacted people's ability to move forward or not move forward in their life. And I think these kinds of discussions help to actually open that up and allow us to move forward. I appreciated your description of me, just short of being a journalist, but a listener and a collector of stories. And I would also say that over the years, what I've done best is connect ideas with people and share those stories and reflect them in such a way that people can see themselves. So I'm always having an ear out for the thing that's going to resonate. The thing that resonates with me, I know is going to resonate with also millions of other people, because I see myself and have always seen myself as the surrogate viewer. I get to be the one that holds the microphone, but I really am just representing everybody else. So I've done many interviews, as Bruce said, over the years, talking about trauma, had also interviewed him many times. He never used that phrase. And so in 2018, we were doing this interview on the St. A Center in Milwaukee, which serves the inner city of Milwaukee and works with a lot of disadvantaged and underserved children. And Bruce used this phrase of, many times these young Black boys and brown boys are expelled from school because the teachers don't understand them. They're saying, what's wrong with this kid? What's wrong with this kid? And they should be asking the question, what happened to you? And I will tell you, the little hairs on my arm stood up. I went, bing, 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 bing. It resonated in such a way that I heard it, and I knew if I heard it, lots of other people would hear it. And that 60-minute story went all over the world. And that point of reference to that question of what happened to you resonated in such a way that I got a call from the publisher, Flatiron, saying, you think Bruce would be interested in doing a book about what happened to you? I said, I don't know if he wants to write a book about it. So that's how it happened. But I knew, because for me, Bruce, it changed everything. I had been having such difficulty at my school in South Africa that I'd opened in 2007. And had been working with Bruce Perry and his team on the neurosequential model for trauma at my school. And one of the things that was so hard to communicate to the teachers and the administrators there, although we were providing this incredible environment for underserved girls who had come from backgrounds where on average, every girl comes into school with at least 6 ACEs, because when I opened the school, it was when AIDS was at its highest.
By ACEs, we mean adverse childhood experiences. Just
that's what we
footnote.
Mean.
Yes.
Yeah, footnote. Okay. So on average, a girl comes in. So some have 10 and some have, 4, but on average, we're about 6. So every girl has suffered some kind of adverse childhood experience. And we thought that we could fix that with math and science. We thought we could fix that with dance and humanities and all that other stuff. And we could not. We could not. So this question of understanding what happened to you is as important a question as who am I? Because who am I actually stems from what happened to me.
And you disclose a little bit of that in the book. You do your own, a little bit of your own What Happened to Me.
To me, yes.
Book as a kind of road into some of these issues. And you describe some of the difficult family issues that you wrestle with now. And I felt a little bit in reading it as if I was, listening to you. And I was trying to think, well, okay, Oprah, I've as a reader asked Oprah, what happened to you? And now she's telling me, but this is hard stuff. And I wonder, beyond asking the question, what happened to you, how you each think about how we then listen, how we become receptive listeners how we make connection when people try to communicate the what happened to you. I think there's a kind of a big gap in people's ability to hear that now.
The key, Bruce, is understanding that this isn't a question about blame. This isn't about blaming your mama and blaming your daddy and blaming what happened. It's a question that helps you explain. And once you can begin to explain, you begin to understand why you have the world view that you have, why you have the fears that you have, why you have the behaviors that you have, based upon what happened to you when you were at an age where you cannot even remember all the things that happened to you. You just know that you were in a chaotic environment. For me, I knew that I was in an environment where there were many times I did not feel safe, and I felt that I was alone and that I had to depend upon myself. And I, tell the story about how, as a young girl, I remember my grandfather coming into the bedroom late at night, trying to strangle my grandmother, and because I was sleeping in the bed with my grandmother, and her being able to push him off of her. And after that, she put a chair up against the door with tin cans tied to the chair. And that is how I went to bed every night. She'd say, make sure the chair's up against the door. And I test the cans to make sure that they'd rattle if you move them. And years later, in my 40s, in my high-rise apartment in Chicago, in the middle of the night, I have to get up and go to check into a hotel because I cannot sleep in a house in an apartment, knowing that there's a doorman downstairs and there's security and there's everything else. And I can't figure out what that is. Why is that? And I read in the newspaper about a high school principal after one of the first major shootings in Chicago in the 90s. A girl named Lori Dann had come into a suburban school and shot up a class. And the principal was being criticized by the parents because the parents wanted him to lock the doors and chain the doors in the school. And the principal said, I will not chain the doors because it will send the message to the children that they are not safe. And I read this in the Chicago Tribune and I start crying because I have this sense memory of that is what happened to me when my grandmother put the chair against the door, put the tin cans against the door. And for all of the rest of my years with my grandmother, I slept with a sense of listening for those tin cans. And later in my high-rise apartment, Oprah Winfrey shows, Top of the World, doing this, I'm still listening for those tin cans. So that's just one example.
Yeah, no, and Dr. Perry, as a child psychiatrist and a psychiatrist and neuroscientist generally, when you hear Oprah tell that story, when you listen to it, you hear the words, you also, in a sense, hear her brain and hear her body reacting in adulthood in neurochemical ways that have swept through her life. I'm here with a room full of people who care about trauma, are interested in your book, but also many of whom are journalists. What's the most important way from your experience to be a receptive listener when that kind of a story is offered as generously as Oprah just offered this still difficult and harrowing experience and its connection? Yeah. How do we listen?
It's interesting because you mentioned earlier in the introduction resilience. And one of the things that I think people have to get comfortable with if you're going to listen to a story that has emotional intensity is that you need to get comfortable with distress. You need to be able to sit in pain and darkness. And it's very hard to do. And many people, because of that, they will try to either deflect or say, you're going to be fine, or that's okay. Or they say, well, your people are resilient, and we write about that in the book. And I think one of the biggest challenges, I think for people who are journalists, it's a very hard thing because you go in and you're asking about these terrible things, the loss of a child, the explosion down the street, the natural disaster that destroyed somebody's life savings, all of that kind of stuff. You have to sit with this pain. And one of the things we talk about in the book is that human beings are fundamentally contagious to other human beings. And so when you're speaking with somebody or listening to somebody who's in pain, you begin to feel some of their pain. And so I think the most important thing to do is to learn how to not undo it. Mm-hmm. and be there. And one of the things that Oprah has been wonderful about over the years, and this is why I think people love talking with her and like watching her do interviews, is that she can sit in the darkness with people. She can sit with the pain without stopping it. And it's a lot easier to voyeur than to be the person who's sitting there with that person. But I think that's a very powerful capability. And I think it's hard to learn. And it's something that you have to practice. And it's something that you need to learn how to protect. You need to learn how to take care of yourself afterwards. And Oprah wants to jump in here.
I was going to say that in the early days of my learning how to be a talk show host and listening to people's stories, I was not comfortable sitting in the pain. And what I would do is I would do what many interviewers or journalists do. You would try to follow up with a question. You'd ask an uncomfortable question. The person starts telling the story, and you try to fill the space. You would not allow for the silence when a person is trying to, gather their thoughts, or they're caught up in the moment and they can't find the exact right words. You try to step in and try to fill the space, fill that energy up because of your own uncomfortability, and you didn't want them to be uncomfortable. And what I learned over the years is to do exactly what Bruce said, is just to sit with it. One of the most powerful interviews I had done in recent years with a gentleman named Shaka Sankour, who spent 19 years in prison, 9 of those years on death row for a murder that he committed, and then was released and has done incredible things with his life. But I asked him the question of, tell me why you think you ended up in jail. And he started to talk about going around with the wrong crowd and, hanging out with these gangs. And I said, I don't actually think it happened then. I think it happened when you were 9 years old and you came home and your mother was at the stove and you went to show her your report card and she threw the pot of spaghetti at you. What happened after that? And when I asked him that question, it took him 27 seconds, which on television, as you all know, is a lifetime. I asked him the question and he squirmed, and I could see his eyes watering, and I just sat there and I just waited for the answer. I just waited for the answer.
Sitting with distress and accepting it is actually an interesting challenge right now. I think, and I wonder if either of you have a view on this, among a lot of younger journalists now who are coming into the profession, and younger folks generally coming out of, I think, university experiences where for the first time people are really talking all the time about trauma, about inequities of power. There's a lot of language of trauma out there. There's also a lot of concern that when we start asking people about the worst experiences of their lives, the distress is automatically deeply re-traumatizing, is automatically exploitative, is automatically wounding. How do you think about that? What, in fact, is the value and the risk of going down a difficult path with someone in a interview, in a story?
When Oprah interviews people, they come onto her show, they choose to be there. There's a lot more control over the process of telling their story. And one of the things that always helps somebody tell a story is when they feel safe. And again, this is one of the great skills, that if you feel relationally safe, you're much more likely to be open. And over the years, as Oprah became people knew Oprah, and they felt like they had a relationship with Oprah, even though they watched her on television. And I think that sense of safety allowed people to choose to come and be open. When you meet a stranger and they knock on your door and they're a journalist and says, how do you feel that your child was just shot, 12 hours ago? That's not giving that person control over the process by which they share their story. At some point in their lives, they should have the opportunity to tell their story, but they should be the ones to choose when and how and to whom. And I think that sometimes some journalists get in the way of that. And so I think that for me, and we talk about it in the book, about the difference between stress and stressors and that lead to bad outcomes and stress that leads to resilience and strength is controllability, moderation, and predictability. And I think that when you take that away from people, whether it's in journalism or therapy or anything, you're setting yourself up to add distress to somebody's life as opposed to be a positive force.
So control, moderation. What was the third?
Predictability.
Control.
If people know what to expect.
Predictability.
Can I say this? Can I say this? That one of the things that I do, and I've been doing probably 20 years, is before an interview that is an important interview, and I want the person to really feel comfortable with me, I will have a conversation with them beforehand, before the tape rolls, before there's any kind of formal anything, and ask them, tell me what you want to happen here. Tell me what your intention is. Share with me, tell me. So, and I started doing that like in the 90s. I remember the first time I did it, it was a woman who was on our show because her daughter had been murdered through domestic violence. Her daughter was 16 years old, perfect high school cheerleader, great grades, murdered by an 18-year-old boyfriend in domestic violence, because the domestic violence statistics are as high for young teenage girls as they are for grown women. I did not know that at the time, but that was the facts. And so I went into the green room and I said to her, tell me why, what's your intention in being here, why you're here. She said, I came because your producers, hounded me and wanted me to come on and talk. I said, but what is the reason why you said yes? What is the why? She said, well, because everybody wants to talk about the murder and nobody wants to talk about my daughter's life. They all just want to talk about the murder and how I feel about the murderer. But my daughter had a life, and she was loved. And I want people to know that she was loved. And so I said, I can do that. I can make sure that happens. And so let me tell you what I want. It's going to feel like I'm exploiting your daughter's life because of the questions that I'm asking. It's going to sound like I'm a voyeur, but really I'm trying to allow you to be able to paint a picture of your daughter's life in such a way that every woman who has a 16-year-old daughter out there can see her daughter and your daughter. So that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for those stories that are going to bring her life in such a way that people see themselves. And that was the show for which I got the first Emmy. But that understanding that creating a safe space, that I want you to get what you want, and here's what I want. And I've been doing that for every interview since. Mm-hmm. I want you to get what you want, but here's what I want.
Speaking about someone's daughter makes me realize that we have kind of leapfrogged right over childhood into talking about adult metabolizing trauma. Yeah. Your book is very much, among other things, about childhood and about the emotional dysregulation that an overdose of violence or an overdose of fear in childhood represents, and how children metabolize the fear of the adults and the violence of the adults around them. We're in a kind of singularly fearful time right now for a lot of folks, in which a lot of us as adults and a lot of parents have been dealing with our own emotional dysregulation, our own fear of pandemic, our distress at the legacies of institutional racism and killings of people of color by police, insurrection, tumultuous, polarizing politics, you name it. This is a time where there's a lot of fear. Dr. Perry, maybe let's start with you on this one. How do you think about the pathway for children through this time when so many of us as adults are awash in fear and distress, and in many cases, real unexpected grief and trauma as a consequence of the events around us? How can people manage their own dysregulation, but in particular, kind of shore up their kids at a time when people are going back to school amid masks and it's what's going on? How do we think about children right now in the world?
Yeah, I have to say, I have that conversation like probably 25 times a week. I'm part of a big network that works with schools and mental health systems, literally in 27 different countries. And that set of questions in one way or another has been popping up, as you can imagine, a lot. And we keep returning to the importance of the adults who are around the children doing things that might seem to be selfish, but that are intended to keep them regulated. That if you as the teacher take your breaks and have organizational care models that take care of you, you're going to be able to be better for the children. And again, really, as go the teachers, so go the children. As go the parents, so go the children. So the real key here is having parents, coaches, teachers, people that are spending a lot of time with kids, make sure they understand a little bit about simple regulatory strategies like dosing walks, making sure that there's sensory breaks, not overemphasizing the acquisition of cognitive content, not getting over focused on this sort of mythology that everybody's cognitively behind. The reality is, if you understand the things we wrote about in that book, when you have somebody who's dysregulated, their cortex is shut down. And so if all these kids are coming back to environments where everybody's frazzled and they feel the pressure, we've got to learn more math and we got to catch up, what you're doing is actually doing something that's exactly the opposite of what you should be doing. You need to be creating environments that are predictable, that are nurturing, that are regulated, and you bring rhythm into these environments. And a lot of the things that, parents would go, oh, that's not math. When you're dancing around, that's not math. When you're doing these sort of breathing exercises and that meditation crap, that's not math. Well, if you want to learn math, you need to do those things first. You need to make sure the cortex is open for business. And the only way to do that is to create a safe, predictable environment where the children feel predictability because there's routines. They feel moderation because the challenges that they face are not outrageous, that they're within reach, and that there's a continuous relational environment where they're embraced and contained. And again, the teachers can do that if the teachers themselves are taken care of. And so part of what we need to do is, and we spend a lot of time trying to get school boards and senior administrators in schools to sort of like back off, take your foot off the gas pedal. I mean, if you really want your schools in 2 years or 3 years to be on track again, you need to slow down now. If you want to go far, go slow. Because if you go fast now, you're literally going to break down. The whole school is going to break down. And I think that's one of the big keys.
Oprah, one of the great things about this book for me, one of the fun things, is how much hard science you extract from Dr. Perry in the course of your conversations with him. And there's a tremendous amount of really cool, but also in truth, really daunting, complicated brain science behind all of this. The two of you have been talking for such a long time. What have you learned about how to listen to a scientist and how to translate science into our everyday thinking, which I think is one of the contributions you make here in this book, is kind of structuring the conversation with Dr. Perry about the science. And I'm asking this partly because it's a big part of what we do at the Dart Center too, but also I think in our society right now, listening to scientists is turning out to be a big social problem, right? People unable to listen to science about basic public health messaging is a problem. How have you come to think about this, talking to hardcore scientists and somehow metabolizing it and translating it?
Well, I thought that it was that's a fun question. I thought that it was my job, actually, in this book to take Bruce's science speak and to make it accessible, so that if I were doing a show with him, which we've done several shows together, I would always say, what he's really saying is this, and what he's saying is this. So what he's really saying when he's talking about all that cortex stuff is that when you're arguing with your husband and you're saying, you're not listening to me, you're not listening to me, it's the same thing as trying to reach the cortex, because he really isn't listening to you because he can't, because that's shut down. So I see it and have seen my responsibility over the years with experts, whether they were scientists or psychologists or therapists or psychiatrists, to take their language and break it down and make it accessible to the viewer, because I'm their surrogate.
And I imagine that behind that, you actually spend a lot of time preparing. It's not just this sort of automatic thing, right?
No.
And
A lot of this, like, no, can't use that word. Say that again.
Yeah. No, say that again. No, take that out. Okay.
Say it in English.
What is that whole sentence, Bruce? Nobody knows what the hell you're talking about.
Just like, do that over again.
Well, and I say this because sometimes we think that just getting exactly the right quote is a matter of one phone call, one quick connection with somebody who's an expert in the field. And I think what you're saying, Oprah, is that you've made an investment of time in your relationship with Dr. Perry, and an investment of time and brain space of your own in trying to understand this stuff so you can be that bridge.
Well, yes, I'm saying that. And I'm also saying for anybody who's listening to us now that it doesn't matter how well you phrase it or what your, educational, scientific background is and how it's coached in the language of your people, your tribe. It doesn't matter if you're trying to communicate that and it cannot be heard. So I'm always like, how is this being heard? How is this actually landing with the people you want to speak to? So he and I would have written a very different book if we weren't trying to make it accessible to the masses, really. We wanted this to be a book that people could understand and access the science, but also see themselves in the stories being told.
And we also, one of the things that we knew would happen, we knew a lot of people would struggle with the science, but we tried to dose it and build rhythm into it so that there was just, by the time you kind of got like, oh man, this is too much, we'd sort of back off, and then there would be a completely compelling narrative that Oprah would talk about something. And then we kind of revisit and cycle around to certain concepts again and again. And I think I've heard from so many people that they've enjoyed going back and reading it after they've sort of finished it, and they read certain parts and now they kind of see it differently or they understand it differently.
Mm-hmm. We'll go to questions from the room in about 5 minutes, but I want to ask the two of you something else, which is to take your title, but go from the from the singular to the what happened to us, which is one of your chapter titles. We are in this period of enormous shared global trauma, national and global trauma. We're also at a time when here in the US, we are reckoning with the historical injuries to communities of color and the legacies of historic violence. Maybe, Dr. Perry, start with you. As a scientist, how do you understand collective and historic trauma? This is now thrown around in a very loose way
Right.
There's a relationship between the individual and the present day and the historic. How do you see this intersection, and what kind of language should we be using to think about it?
No, I actually had I grew up being very interested in history. So I've read a lot of history, and if you're a historian, the concept of transgenerational trauma is no surprise at all. I mean, you look at it as sort of a fundamental vein that runs through how you understand the present moment is by understanding the historical trauma that have led to the current circumstances. And so, one of the things I try to keep thinking about is that the complexities we're talking about here, about individual neurobiology, about neurosociology of groups, about culture, about history, these all require somewhat different lenses. And so if you remember when you were in high school and you kind of had the microscope and you could sort of change the lens and you'd see one perspective and then you'd change it again and you'd zone in on something else, I think what we need to be able to do is to recognize that we have to see these things through multiple lenses. That if we don't understand history and culture and cultural genocide and overt genocide, we will never truly understand individual trauma of a client that we're sitting with who happens to be a person of color living in a dominant white community, community. We'll never really recognize the fact that, for example, the university model is basically the most persistent patriarchal model that we have that still exists in the US. And so all of these different, if we don't sort of change the lens and see things clearly at all these different perspectives and respect people who are studying these issues using a different lens or a different perspective, we'll never get anywhere. But part of what happens with academics is that we fight with each other. We talk about, epigenetics explains everything, and then cultural anthropologists, you're not taking into consideration this. And the reality is the human condition is so complex that there is not one single frame of reference or theoretical perspective that can possibly begin to explain it. So we have to be able to have this flexibility in perspective and this respect for other people who are looking at these issues from different lenses. And I think one of the things for me that's always so wonderful about Oprah and I come from completely different perspectives. She's a Black woman from the South that grew up with few resources. I'm a white kid from North Dakota who was privileged, grew up in an upper middle class family, and I went to Stanford and had all kinds of privileged opportunities, but we are able to spend time together and communicate and connect. And I think that the richness doesn't come out of really either one of our perspectives alone. I think it comes out of the joint perspective.
But I have to echo what you're saying, that until there is a fullness of acknowledgement and recognition of the historical injuries to communities of color, it's going to be difficult to continue to move forward. I think the divisions in the country will continue to be even greater than they are, because that's what this movement is calling for. Yeah. It's calling for an understanding of the cultural genocides. It's calling for an understanding of all of the historical violence that's been perpetrated over the years. And that's what last year was all about. All of that marching in the street was about, of course, George Floyd, but about everything that George Floyd also represented, which is exactly what you said, historical injuries.
I think there's also a way, and this maybe, Oprah, goes to the power of storytelling that you have embraced over your career. There's a way in which, if we don't lay out the actual lines of accountability for either present day or historic abuses and try to particularize it, then it just becomes mushy and generalized, and there's never any sense at all of the justice of history, at least. Or I sometimes think about narrative justice, that there are injuries for which there will maybe never be legal or financial or other kinds of there are some wounds for which there's truly no no real
Reparation.
world justice.
Yeah.
But there's at least, here's what happened, why, who did it, who is actually accountable, instead of diffusing responsibility into a generalized hatred of a group, or instead of misdirecting responsibility into self-blame, into shame, into scapegoating, etc. The particularizing that storytelling can do can deliver a certain kind of justice. And we're doing that now. When you visit the Equal Justice Initiative Museum in Montgomery, it's particularizing the
Yes.
stories of each of those people who died by lynching. It's not just saying lynching victims isn't that tragic. It's laying out the facts as we know them. And I think some of what you've done is tried to lay out what's known in the lives of people you interview, even sometimes celebrities who are particularizing their experiences instead of being reduced to caricatures.
Well, I think what you're saying is so important here, Bruce, and that is the particularizing of the story, and specifically in reference to the EJI initiative, the EJI memorial to all of the Black men and women of this country who were lynched. It's hard to visit that memorial and look up at the steel bars representing their bodies and see the names and not have that individualized and personalized in such a way that you can't help but feel that. And so I think the fact that that even exists is a prevalent museum that people go to see regularly is a step in the right direction. And we just need more of that.
Yeah. And I think the combination of listening to survivors and listening to the past, laying out lines of accountability, circles us back to journalism. And I'm going to go to some questions from the room for a couple minutes. One of them is one is a sort of a journalism question, which is, and this is really from both of you, if you had one piece of advice for a young journalist about interviewing trauma survivors, one thing you really want them to know or to think about, or one skill, what would it be? Dr. Perry, you first.
I think that the most important thing is to be present and recognize that just being there and learning how to be attentive but quiet will lead to more important and powerful narrative from that person. Peppering people with questions just literally drives them into themselves. And so if you are present with them, and again, this is very similar to the advice I give to people who do therapeutic work. Be present, attentive, attuned, and then responsive. And so being present is one thing. Attentive is sort of just be aware of how they move and how they change, and the tears in their eyes, as Oprah was pointing out when she sat with Shaka. And that's attuned to how he was. And then the right response, the right response would be to continue to be quiet, as opposed to jump in and say, oh, this is too hard for you. Let's, or to say, or to make it too hard for me. This is too hard for me. So I'm going to ask you, what do you like? What do you like in your pizza? So those are the four things: present, attentive, attuned, and responsive.
Present, attentive, attuned, and responsive. Okay, journalism students, you wrote that all down. Oprah, what do you think?
I would say this. There's this thing that I do is I try to meet the energy in the room, which is exactly what you're saying. You're calling that, what I call it is meeting the energy in the room. Many times I have all of these girls I was saying from South Africa, and 20 of the girls came to the United States, and every single girl who left her home in her disadvantaged, poverty-stricken background came to our school. They were received this beautiful new life, had to go back into that environment and deal with their communities and their families and still be a part of those communities and families. And the first year they all went home, the advice I gave them was to not come in there talking about yourself, to not walk in there with all of your energy of all the things that have been going on at your school and all the great things that have happened in your life, is to walk in the door and meet the energy where it is, and then adjust your energy to whatever is going on in that space. So I think that's the same thing as being present, attentive, and attuned, is
Exactly.
meeting the energy where it is. And oftentimes this happens all the time with journalists. Our journalists will, come into a space and they will bring their energy of their agenda of wanting to get their story. And it does the exact opposite. It repels your energy in a way that you don't want to offer yourself. You don't want to open yourself. You don't want to give of your story, your essence, your giving of yourself when you're doing that. And so what you want to do is to come in and allow your energy to try to match the energy in the room, to meet the energy in the space where it is.
And Bruce, may I just point out, and this is sort of a shout out to journalists, that one of the greatest examples of that everybody can go learn is John Woodrow Cox and his series for the Washington Post, and then the book he wrote. He did exactly that with children and families. He spent time with them. He listened. They told their stories, and he did wonderful, wonderful work. So I think that's a great example of that.
Well, this gives me a perfect opportunity to do a brief ad. John Woodrow Cox, wonderful reporter for the Washington Post, who's reporting on children affected by gun violence, is a winner of the DART Award, which we give every year. And next week is the 2021 DART Awards Winners Roundtable and Ceremony here on Zoom. I'll tell you all more about that at the end. But he is one of those journalists whom we learn from. One of the things that strikes me about his reporting, and here's something that I wonder what the two of you think about, is how we, as we're telling more and more stories about trauma, which the world is, and there's a lot of language being thrown around very loosely out there, how we avoid stepping into trauma cliches. I mean, I know the two of you write a little bit about this kind of tension between wanting to understand that people are resilient and yet not using resilience as a distraction from the reality of trauma, but also wanting to understand the difference between distress and trauma and not conflate all kinds of difficult experiences into long-term psychological injury. Oprah, how do you think about that? It's easy to become a trauma cliche, right? Or to promote
absolutely
trauma cliches.
Easy. And I have actually stopped people in conversations who will say, and I'm sure you all have heard it too, oh my God, this year's just been so traumatizing. Well, this year it's been traumatizing for some people. And this year has been difficult for a lot of people and challenging and isolating, but has it really been traumatizing for everybody who has experienced being at home with the pandemic? So I think now that we're speaking more and more about it, it's so easy to trivialize it and make trauma be about everything and not about the specific things that literally are traumatizing. What do you say, Bruce? Dr. Perry?
No, I'm with you on that. I think, again, we wrote about that in the book a little bit, and I do the same thing. When somebody talks about the fact that it was traumatic because somebody, they had a little argument with somebody about a mask in a grocery store. I'm like, I'm sure that wasn't good, but I don't think that's trauma. I don't think you were traumatized, and, or the idea that, I think we need to be more precise about our language.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. Another question that's in the chat, and that also is kind of a version of something I wanted to ask the two of you, is, both of you are listeners to difficult stories, and you're spending a lot of time thinking about pretty difficult experiences in life that can be pretty haunting. How do you take care of yourselves as listeners, and how should, whether it is journalists who are immersing themselves in stories of survivors, or other people, listeners, readers, activists, people dealing with trauma in their own family. As listeners, how do we take care of ourselves?
I'll answer that today.
Yeah, please.
Speaking of, I did an interview today, a podcast and something for Oprah Daily with Dr. Dennis Mukwege, the Nobel Peace Prize doctor who has spent his life taking care of rape survivors in the Congo. And he speaks in his book, and also spoke to me today, about sometimes being so dispirited that he was covered in a shroud of sadness, was his words for it. And that the only thing that kept him going and keeps him going is the women whom he serves seem to find a way to develop meaning and purpose in their lives after the most horrific things have happened to them. So he takes strength from the women that he serves, and also his faith. But I'm mentioning him because he would be an excellent person for you all to interview for the DART Center, Dr. Mukwege, and his book is called The Power of Women.
It's a deal.
Okay.
Dr. Perry, how do you think about this kind of taking care of yourself question?
Well, that as you well know, is a huge issue. All the systems, excuse me, that I work in, education, mental health, and there's two parts of this. One is sort of the individual, techniques or things that you do. I personally find exercise and being out in nature tremendously regulating, and I'm just lucky that I have a great team of people that help support me. But I think the people we work with who do this work day in and day out, one of the most important things is that we need to get our systems to begin to change so that the burden of creating a regulating, safe, nurturing environment is going to be a core element of self-care. It's not just on you. No self-care program in the world can overcome a terrible, grinding organizational process that disrespects you, that underpays you, that marginalizes you, that minimizes you, all of that kinds of stuff. And all of our organizations, and whether we like it or not, every single one of our systems right now in the United States is a carry forward of a power structure that was created by white men who were trying to basically, increase their wealth at the expense of others. And so these systems are literally created to marginalize and minimize and exploit people at the bottom of the organizational chart. And so until we change those organizational models, we're going to have a lot of frontline people that are worn out and worn to a nub, and turnover is going to be an issue. And again, self-care is one thing, but if you don't change organizational care models, it's just, they're going to be like salmon swimming upstream up against a dam.
And that certainly is an argument and a discussion going on right now in the global journalism community, exactly the terms that you describe it. I'm going to ask you both one more question, and then
Sure.
we'll wrap it. Two words that you use in the book a lot, kind of two terms of phrase, especially toward the end. You end up talking a lot about connectedness and post-traumatic wisdom. And those two phrases kind of lead the book, considering the very difficult terrain that you're on and the difficult times we're in, to end on a surprisingly optimistic note. Talk a little bit about those things and how you understand them each from your own perspective, the role of connectedness and this idea of kind of post-traumatic wisdom and how it can enable us to think about the future. I don't know, Dr. Perry, you want to go first on that one?
Sure. So one of the things that we try to write about, and I think is pretty apparent, is that as people make their way through life, there are always going to be challenges, and you just cannot get through life without loss, pain, unpredictability, and so forth. And I think that one of the things that I think it's important for people to appreciate is that journey that you make, your personal journey, is so much easier if it's done in the presence of people who are caring, people who you belong to. If you have a clan, a family, a community, a culture that helps you make your way through life, things will be better. And that is so intimately tied in with the neurobiology of human beings. You know, human beings are intended to live in connection, to live in groups, and the physiology of reward and regulation and the way we heal from trauma, all of these things are dependent upon the quality of our relational opportunities. And I think that that's those, you know, those two concepts are very much intertwined. People who have had developmental trauma or trauma along the way and are now in a safe place in their lives have the ability to reflect on the past and have a certain form of perspective and wisdom that you can't get if you haven't been challenged. Mm-hmm. And I think that every wise person I know has had a really significant history of challenges in their lives. Some of them overtly traumatic, and some maybe not so much so, but very, very much challenged. I think is not something that always has to lead to these bad outcomes.
Yeah.
So, and I'm going to let
Oprah, how do you think about this, the connectedness and post-traumatic wisdom and pathways forward from adversity?
There was an old Black spiritual that used to say, "Wouldn't take nothing for my journey now, for my journey now, for my journey now, wouldn't take nothing for my journey now." And that essentially was the story that Black folks told themselves for hundreds of years, because we understood that what had happened to us had given us a kind of strength and a kind of wisdom that was in its own way a power to help us to keep standing. And so what I understand fundamentally, having come from where I've come from, a great, great, great granddaughter of slaves in this country, that you can take what has happened to you, the pain and suffering and injuries of the past, if you recognize how they shaped your behavior and what impact they've had on your life and what you can do to change that, you can take that pain and you can turn it into power.
And that, I think, is as good a place as any to end. We haven't done justice, Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey, to your wonderful book, What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing. For anyone watching who hasn't bought it yet, please go out and do so. You will learn a lot about science. You'll learn a lot about life. You'll enjoy the conversation between these
You'll learn a lot about yourself. You got to say that, Bruce. You'll learn a lot about yourself.
It's true. You will learn a lot about yourself in the course of it. I want to do a couple of other thank yous. I want to thank Dr. Perry's team and Oprah Winfrey's team for making this happen. It's a really exciting thing. I want to thank the DART Center team who are behind the scenes. Thank all of you who are here today, and in particular those who put questions into the chat. We couldn't get to anywhere near all of them, but by all means, keep thinking about those questions and arguing about them even when we're no longer on Zoom. For those of you who are with us for the first time, I invite you to visit the DART Center's website, www.dartcenter.org, where you'll find a lot of resources for working journalists and for people who teach journalism, for anyone who's interested in the work of the media on these crucial issues, both about the craft of covering vulnerable people and communities, of covering traumatic events, of staying safe, and also about the impact of difficult assignments on journalists and how our news organizations can meet the challenge that Dr. Perry described. And again, if you want more, I invite you next Thursday, September 30th at 6 p.m. to join the DART Center on Zoom for our 27th annual DART Awards for outstanding coverage of trauma. You'll meet some profound journalists from around the US who spent all of 2020 doing deeply searching work, some of it on the pandemic, on the murder of Mr. Floyd, some of it on other issues like sexual abuse and the desire of victims of sexual violence for justice. We'll have a winners roundtable talking about these stories and the choices that these reporters made along the way. Please join us. Again, Dr. Bruce Perry, again, Oprah Winfrey, thank you very much, and thank all of you